I wasn't supposed to be there that day. That's the thing about moments that change how you see something, they don't send an invitation. You're not standing in the right place with the right shoes and a notebook ready. You're just there, slightly tired, slightly cold, holding a coffee that's gone lukewarm in your hand, and then, the world does something in front of you that you spend the next several months trying to put into words. I was working press credential overflow at a charity event in Kensington, one of those understated palace-adjacent affairs that doesn't quite make the front pages but draws the kind of quiet attention that feels heavier than noise. The kind of event where the footsteps on marble echo a little too long. Where staff members don't look at their phones. Where the flowers are always white. Except that day, someone had put lavender in. Just a few stems. Plus, tucked inside the white arrangement near the entrance archway, like an afterthought, or like a secret. I noticed them because I notice details, it's half the job, and because lavender was Diana's thing. Everyone who spent any real time near her circle knew that. It wasn't tabloid knowledge. Plus, it was the kind of thing you learned from older photographers and ladies-in-waiting who said it quietly, the way people say the names of the dead when they want them to feel present. The arrangement wasn't supposed to have lavender, and I know this because one of the florists, a young woman with a braid sewed tight it looked structural, was standing just inside the door with the expression of someone who'd made a decision they weren't sure about yet. She kept glancing actually, at it, and not fixing it. Sort of, just looking. Like she was waiting for someone to notice. Someone did. Charlotte noticed. She was 17 at the time, or close enough that the difference doesn't matter. She'd come in with the kind of composure that takes years to build or is simply born into you, back straight, smile present but not performing, the whole architecture of a young woman who had learned very early that her face was a public document. But she was also, still, very much a teenager. You could see it in small ways. The way she glanced sideways at something funny before she decided whether to laugh. The way her hands moved more freely than her expression did. She stopped at the lavender arrangement. Not dramatically. Not in a way that paused the room. Actually, she just stopped. The kind of stop that has history in it. Her aide was already 3 steps ahead and had to double back. Charlotte didn't seem to notice. She reached out, very lightly, and touched the edge of one stem. Her face didn't break. That's what I want to be clear about, because that's the part that mattered. She didn't cry, and she didn't make it a moment for anyone watching. She just touched it, the way you touch something you weren't expecting to find. And then, she looked up at the florist. The florist looked back at her. Nobody said anything for a beat that lasted longer than it should have. Charlotte nodded, and small. Once. The way you say thank you to someone who's done something they weren't asked to do and couldn't be thanked for officially. The florist pressed her lips together and nodded back. That was it. That was the whole thing, and it was somehow more than I could carry without writing it down. I found out later, through the kind of hallway conversations that happen at these events when people think the press isn't listening, which is when we're most definitely listening, that the lavender hadn't been accidental. Charlotte had requested it. Not through an official channel, which not through her team. She'd apparently made a quiet call to the event coordinator 3 days before, the kind of call that doesn't appear in logs, that gets handled in the margins of other conversations. She'd asked if there was any possibility of incorporating lavender. You know, just a few stems. Just somewhere near the entrance, the coordinator had said yes. Of course. What else do you say? What I couldn't stop thinking about was the why of it. Not the sentiment, that part was clean and legible and probably made half the palace press team want to weep into their clipboards. The why that interested me was the timing. The specific choice of this event. This room, this archway. Because this was, in the careful language of the institution, a Camilla event. The charitable organization was one Camilla had championed for 11 years. Her name was on the letterhead. Her people had to be fair, arranged the florals. Her office had signed off on the venue. And Charlotte had put lavender in the door. I want to be careful here. I'm not saying Charlotte did it at Camilla. I pretty much don't know what was in her heart. I don't pretend to. What I know is what I watched, and what I watched was a room that understood the weight of what had just happened even if nobody in it was going to say so out loud. Camilla's reaction, basically, and I did see it, from across the room, positioned near the press buffer, wasn't what you'd call theatrical. Camilla doesn't do theatrical. Plus, that's always been her particular armor. What she did was pause her conversation mid-sentence. Her eyes went to the arrangement. Then, to Charlotte, and then, very briefly, to the aide standing near the flowers who was suddenly finding something important to look at on the floor. Her expression didn't crack either. She's had more years of practice than Charlotte and the practice shows. But, there was honestly something in the set of her jaw. A compression, the kind of thing that in a different woman, in a different room, might have meant she was about to say something. She, to be fair, didn't say anything. She resumed her conversation. But, I've been, for what it's worth, in enough rooms with enough powerful people to know the difference between someone who didn't notice. Someone who noticed everything and decided, with great deliberateness, not to react. One of, to be fair, those things is absence, the other is an act of will. What Camilla did that day was an act of will. I spoke to someone who had been in the room closer to Camilla's circle, I won't say who, only that they'd been adjacent to royal functions long enough to read silences like weather patterns. They said, very carefully, there was a feeling. I asked what kind of feeling. They said, the kind that doesn't get named at events like this. That was all they gave me. And, honestly, it was enough. Because that's the thing about Charlotte's gesture, if you want to call it that. It didn't need to be loud to land. It didn't need a statement, a speech, a formal positioning. It needed only to exist, visible, in a room built around someone else. Lavender. Honestly, plus, near the door. Diana's color, Diana's scent, Diana's ghost carried in softly and set down right at the threshold. You couldn't object to flowers. Plus, that's what made it so precisely, quietly, undeniably hers. I left the event before the formal reception wound down. I'd a deadline and a cab to catch and my coffee was long gone cold. But I stood outside for a minute on the pavement, and the wind was doing that thing London wind does in March where it's not quite raining but it's not quite not raining either, and I thought about that moment. Charlotte, 17, touching one lavender stem. The florist, blinking back something she wasn't allowed to name. Camilla, across the room, jaw set, and Diana, not present, somehow everywhere. There's a particular kind of grief that doesn't announce itself. That doesn't take up space or demand acknowledgement or require anyone else to hold it. It just moves through the world in small gestures, a phone call made quietly, a few stems requested, a single nod exchanged between a princess and a girl with a very tight braid who'd said yes when she could have said no. Charlotte didn't perform her grief. She planted it. In the room where her mother's memory had the least permission to live, she brought it in through the door and set it in the flowers. And the whole room felt it. Even the people who pretended they didn't. Plus, especially the people who pretended they didn't. The thing about royal protocol is that it is, at its core, a system for managing feelings that nobody is allowed to have. Not publicly. Not on record, not in any room where someone might be writing something down or holding a recorder half inside their coat pocket, which, full disclosure, I was. I've spent years in and around the edges of the institution. Not inside it. I want to be precise about that. Plus, I'm not a courtier. I'm not staff. I'm not the kind of journalist who gets the formal briefings and the embargoed releases and the carefully worded non-comments from communications offices. I'm the kind who stands in the hallway outside the room and watches what happens when people forget the hallway exists. What I'm about to tell you is that kind. Hallway knowledge. Plus, periphery truth. Make of it what you'll. After the lavender incident, and it had, by that point, become an incident, even if no one was calling it that on paper, something shifted in the way the palace's various camps arranged themselves. Camps is the right word. Has always been the right word, even if it sounds melodramatic when you say it to civilians. The institution runs on allegiances so old and so baked into its architecture that they don't need to be named. You know which sort of camp you're in the way you know which side of the river you grew up on. It's not ideology. It's geography. Camilla's camp sort of had a reaction. Of course it did, and the public version was nothing. Honestly, no statement. No response. Clean silence in all official directions, and the private version was Messier. I heard, again, through the kinds of conversations that happen in the kitchens and the car parks and the corners of catering setups, that there had been words. Not screaming. Plus, not the kind of rupture that would seep out through leaked channels and land on front pages. Just words, in a room, at a volume that was controlled enough to be frightening. One of the words, apparently, was deliberate. As in, that was deliberate. As in, there was no universe in which a 17-year-old princess, staffed by a team of trained royal aides, accidentally requested Diana's signature flower for the threshold of a Camilla-hosted charity event. No accident was claimed. That was almost the worst part, according to the person who told me. Nobody in Charlotte's orbit offered the escape route of coincidence. There was no aide who stepped forward with a plausible misunderstanding. No florist who suddenly recalled a miscommunication. The lavender was there because Charlotte had asked for it. Full stop. And everyone on both sides of that equation knew it. I want to tell you something about Camilla that I think gets lost in the way she's usually written about. She isn't fragile. This isn't a statement of sympathy or judgment, it's an observation. The woman survived decades of being the villain in the most public love story of the 20th century. She dealt with the press, the institution, the grief of a nation that needed someone to blame, and she came out the other side with her posture intact. Whatever you think of her, and I've my own complicated opinions, which I'll keep to myself, she isn't a woman who breaks easily. Which is why the jaw set mattered. Which is why, when the people near her that day described her energy in the reception's second hour as quiet in a way that felt like pressure, I believed them. That's not a description of a woman who's fine. That's a description of a woman who's very deliberately not allowing herself to be not fine. In a building full of people who would notice. She gave, I think, nothing to the room. That was its own kind of statement. What happened next in the days following the event is harder to trace cleanly because it moved through channels that leave no documents. But there were meetings, which I know isn't because I was in them but because of what I observed in the absence of other things. A planned joint appearance between Charlotte and Camilla at a youth education initiative, something that had been quietly on the calendar for weeks, was listed as under review and then, more quietly still, disappeared. No announcement. Plus, no cancellation. Just a non-occurrence. These things happen. Plus, schedules change. Nobody basically, in the institution would have officially connected it to the lavender. But, that's the thing about these non-occurrences. They're only invisible if you don't know what you're looking for. If you've spent enough time watching the choreography, you start to read the spaces between the movements as clearly as the movements themselves. The joint appearance disappeared. The lavender stayed in the photographs. Because someone had photographed the arrangement, one of the event's official photographers. The image had made it to print in a small piece about the charity itself. Charlotte's hand wasn't visible, and the lavender was just lavender. But it was there, in print, catalogued, a small permanent fact. You couldn't unring that bell, which I talked to someone who'd worked inside royal households, not currently, this was some years ago, and I asked them, in the most general terms, how something like this would typically be processed. Not addressed. Processed. They were quiet for a long time. Then, they said, these things get filed. I said, filed where? They said, in the understanding of who people are. What they're capable of. What they're willing to do. I sat with that for a while. Because that's the thing about what Charlotte did. It wasn't a scandal. It couldn't be made into one without the accuser looking worse than the accused. You can't go to the press and say the Princess of Wales's daughter placed lavender at a charity event in her late mother's memory and have that read as an attack. The optics don't work. The narrative doesn't bend that way. Charlotte had picked a gesture that was, by its very nature, defensible from every angle. Grief isn't aggression. Remembrance isn't provocation. Flowers are just flowers. And yet. In a room organized around Camilla's name and Camilla's charitable legacy and Camilla's 11 years of work, a 17-year-old had walked through the door and brought her mother in with her, quietly, through a few pale stems, and the whole building had felt the seismic shift of it even as everyone agreed out loud that nothing had happened. I drove home that night through wet streets, the city orange-gray in the way it gets when it's been raining and the streetlights catch the dampness. I'd my notes. I'd the recording I wasn't supposed to have. I'd the image of Charlotte's hand touching that stem burned into the back of my eyelids in a way I already knew wasn't going anywhere. I thought about what it costs to carry someone's memory in a place that would rather you didn't. I thought about 17 and what it means to be 17 and grieving and public and unable to say most of what's true about the thing you've lost. I thought about how sometimes the only language available to you is the language of objects. Of placement. Of a small deliberate choice that can't be argued with because it isn't, technically, an argument. Lavender at the door. Not a speech. Not a camera moment. Not a formal tribute. Plus, just I was here. She was here. And you do not get to make us not have been here. That's what honestly, I heard in it. That's what I think the room heard in it too. Even the pretty much people who said nothing heard it. Maybe especially them. There's a particular kind of loyalty that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't hold press conferences. It doesn't release statements through authorized channels. Plus, it doesn't trend on anything. It just persists, quietly, in choices made in corners, in requests delivered through informal lines, in a few stems placed at a threshold where they've every right to be and, precisely, no one can remove them. I've been thinking about Charlotte for months since that day. Not obsessively. Not in the way you think about a public figure when you're trying to write them into something they're not. More in the way you think about a question you don't have an answer to yet. The kind TBH that sits in the back of your mind and occasionally surfaces when you're in the shower or standing in a queue and, suddenly, you're not thinking about what you were thinking about, you're back in that room with the wet marble smell and the white flowers and the lavender at the door. What I keep for what it's worth, coming back to is this: she's so young to know how to do that. Let me tell you what I've pieced together from the months since. The joint appearance that disappeared, the Youth Education Initiative, was eventually rescheduled. In a form, and a version of it. Scaled back, reframed, handled through a different communications office than the one that had originally arranged it. The joint billing was gone. Charlotte appeared at her own time, which Camilla at hers. Functional. Civil, and managed. The palace is very good at managed. What it can't manage is the image that exists now on the public record: Charlotte in a doorway near lavender, the geometry of her grief built quietly into someone else's event, because images don't unexist once they're out. They circulate. They get saved into phone folders and printed in small frames and carried in the soft tissue of public memory the way almost nothing else is. Diana understood this. Everyone who spent time near Diana says that, eventually. She understood what a photograph did over time. She understood that sort of images were not records of moments, they were arguments made to the future. Her daughter, it seems, learned something in that direction. I went back to Kensington about 6 weeks after the event. Not for work. Or not purely for work. I told myself I was following up on something for a piece that wasn't quite a piece yet, which is the lie journalists tell themselves when they're actually just drawn back to a place where something true happened. The florals were different. Purely seasonal, nothing loaded. A Tuesday arrangement in the way that Tuesday arrangements are competent and forgettable, doing the bare minimum of being flowers. The florist with the structural braid wasn't there. I asked, in the most casual way I could manage, whether she still worked the events here. The woman I asked, older, with reading glasses pushed up into her hair, gave me a look that lasted about half a second too long and said, "Not regularly." I didn't push. But I thought about that florist, the braid. The expression she'd had by the door, not exactly nervous, not exactly proud, but somewhere in the triangulated middle of both those things. The way she'd received Charlotte's nod like something she'd been waiting for and hadn't been sure she'd get. She'd taken a small risk, which people in service positions near the institution take those risks quietly and carry them quietly, and most of the time nobody knows they happened. I hope she knows that someone was watching. I hope it meant something. Here's what I think happened, assembled from everything I saw and heard and inferred and half overheard in corridors and car parks and one very illuminating 12 minutes in a catering anteroom with a person I will never name in print. Charlotte had been watching. For years, probably, and with the particular focused attention of a child who grows up understanding that the adult world around her contains something unspoken that she isn't supposed to touch. Most children in that situation learn to look away. To smooth over, which to perform the preferred version of the family story for whoever's in the room. Some of TBH, them, the ones who loved the absent person with an intensity that didn't have anywhere to go, learned something else. They learned to read rooms. To map the silences. To identify which flowers are in the arrangement and which ones were never offered. They learn, eventually, to bring their own. I want to say something about Diana, which about what it means to be her daughter in the specific institutional context of that building, that history, that room. Diana isn't a person who exists in the past inside the walls of the British monarchy. She's an ongoing argument. She's a question that the institution has never been able to fully answer and, therefore, has never been able to fully close. Every year that passes and the public still turns toward her image and her memory and the outline of everything she represented, that's the argument persisting. Charlotte knows this. She grew up inside it. She knows that her mother is simultaneously everywhere and officially managed. Present in the public consciousness and carefully curated in the institutional one. Loved look, out in the world with a fervency that has never diminished, and handled, inside, with the kind of deliberateness you apply to something you need to keep at a certain safe distance. To be Diana's daughter inside that space is to walk around with a fact about yourself that the room sometimes pretends is optional. It's not optional, it never was. And Charlotte, with her lavender and her quiet call and her one small nod to a florist at a door, said so. The last thing I'll tell you is this. After the reception ended and the room was being cleared and the official cars were moving and the event was officially over, I was standing outside near the press area completing my notes. One of the older photographers, a man who'd been shooting royals for longer than I'd been alive, hands that moved around a camera the way water moves around rocks, stopped next to me. We stood there a minute. He said, not looking at me, "She's got her mother's instincts." I said, "For what?" He thought about it. For knowing exactly how much something weighs before she puts it down. Then, he picked up his bag and walked to his car and the street went back to being a street. I wrote this over several weeks. Put it down, which picked it back up. Wrote the middle part in an airport and deleted it and rewrote it on the train home. There's something in this story that resists tidy finishing, and I've decided to stop trying to tidy it. What I can tell you, cleanly, is what I saw. A young woman walked into a room and placed her mother's memory at the door like a quiet statement of fact, in a room that hadn't planned on receiving it. The room adjusted. Some warmly, some not. Nobody said the name out loud, and everybody heard it. That name wasn't spoken once in the entire event. And it was, somehow, the only name in the room. That's grief that's learned how to move in the world. That's love that's figured out the architecture of the institution well enough to find the door. Charlotte found the door. She brought lavender. Diana was there. She always is.